morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Boston Globe's inaugural Health and Biotech Week. I'm the Globe's Health and Biotechnology editor, Anna Kuchman. Before I get started and introduce our guest for today, I wanted to tell everyone that we'll be taking live questions during this session, which is called Life After Government, a Fireside Chat with Dr. Fauci. You can ask us questions live by clicking on the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'm happy to have here with us today, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Fauci stepped down in December as director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is part of the NIH, and as President Biden's chief medical advisor. Dr. Fauci, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure. It's good to be with you today.
So I'd like to just start with the news of the day. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal broke the news that the Department of Energy concluded with low confidence that the COVID-19 pandemic most likely emerged from a lab leak in Wuhan, China. That puts the DOE in line with the FBI's position as well. And I just wanted to get your reaction to that. What's your opinion of that finding?
Well, I think the first important thing is that we must all keep an open mind as to all possibilities need to be entertained. There certainly is a dichotomy of opinion on that. The FBI and now the DOE with low confidence feels that it was a lab leak, whereas 4 other intelligence agencies feel with low confidence that it actually was a natural occurrence. The data that evolutionary virologists have submitted and published in peer-reviewed journals rather strongly suggests that it was a natural occurrence. So the only thing we could say is that there appears to be obviously a disagreement. I'm not sure exactly the data upon which the Department of Energy statement was made. It would be nice to see those data in order to make an evaluation of the validity of that. But again, the bottom line is we need to keep an open mind until one definitively nails down what the origin is.
In your opinion, how likely do you think it is to have originated as a lab leak or lab accident?
It's very tough to say. I mean, you have to look at the data. I don't see any data for a lab leak. That doesn't mean it could not have happened, and that's the reason why I keep an open mind always about that. But the thing that I think is rather compelling is if you look at a group of international evolutionary virologists have examined the situation epidemiologically and virologically in and around the Wuhan markets and have come to the conclusion, without necessarily being 100% certain, but they are strongly feeling that this was a natural occurrence. And they published this in Science in 2 articles in a peer-reviewed journal, Science. Whether or not that is actually the case, again, you have to keep an open mind, and that's what we're all doing, is to keeping an open mind. But the evolutionary virologists who've examined this carefully feel that it was a natural occurrence.
Personally, do you feel like it's about 50-50, the evidence or lack?
I don't think you can go there. I'm not putting any numbers on it, no.
What do you think needs to be done to get to the bottom of the pandemic's origins?
I think we need openness and transparency in order to allow international scientists, including Chinese scientists, to be able to go into China, in Wuhan, look at serosurveys, monitor what viruses are actually circulating in the animal population and the bat population, and in those wild animals that are brought to market, which could have been the source of the jumping of species, if in fact that did happen. So there needs to be a lot more investigation into the origin. It's very difficult to do if you don't have access to the location in which it occurred. And that's the reason why it would be optimal if we had better cooperation and collaboration between non-Chinese and Chinese authorities. I think that would go a long way to getting more information to be able to essentially resolve this issue.
Do you think we'll ever know how the pandemic originated?
Might not. It very well might not. We may not ever know. That's unfortunate, but that's the possibility that we might not ever know.
Okay, well, let's move on from the pandemic's origins to how things stand now. Can you just talk a little bit about how you think where we stand now in the pandemic trajectory? Just kind of tell us where we are
Sure.
now.
Well, I mean, if you look at where we are now with regard to the prevalence of transmission, the hospitalizations per day, the number of deaths per day, we are dramatically better off than we were a year ago this time in the first few months of Omicron, where we were having 800 to 900,000 new infections a day and 3,000 to 4,000 deaths per day. Now we're very, very much lower than that, with about 400 to 500 deaths per day, which means we're doing much better. But, and it's a big but, we shouldn't be complacent about the fact that we're still seeing 400, 450, and sometimes 500 deaths per day. That's unacceptably high. So there's good news and there's sobering news. The good news is that we're much better off than we were a year ago. The sobering news is that we're not out of the woods yet on this. We still have a situation, although it's much, much better, that there's still enough virus circulating, enough people who are not vaccinated and or not updated on their boosters, that we can do much better than we're doing now. For example, only about 69% of the total population is vaccinated. We need to do much better. When you compare us with other countries, even countries in the developing world, our vaccination level isn't as good as many countries. Number two, if you look at the eligible people who are eligible to get the updated BA.4/5 boost, only about 19% of them have gotten that updated boost. Again, we need to do much better than that. So that's what I mean about good news, sobering news. We're doing better than we were, but we can do a lot better.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know it's kind of hard to predict, but I mean, how and when do you think we will get to a place where COVID-19 recedes, even more as a threat compared to today?
Well, that's up to us, Anna. It's totally up to us. We can make that occur much more rapidly if we are doing the things that one needs to do to contain the outbreak, and namely, get vaccinated for those who are unvaccinated, get up to date on your boosting, testing where appropriate when you're in a situation where you might be exposed or exposing others, wearing a mask, not mandating a mask. I'm not talking about mandating anything. I'm talking about using common sense when you're in a situation of a congregate, crowded setting in an area, a region where the level of infection is high. It would make sense to protect yourself and your families and those to whom you yourself might be exposed. Those are the things we can do to make things better.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of masks, there was an influential report, the Cochrane Review, that came out recently that seemed to cast doubt on the efficacy of masks and led many commentators to say that it was evidence that masks don't work and have never worked. Right. Can you talk a little bit? Can you explain what that review was, what it showed, and what the evidence is for or against, of how efficacious masks are?
Well, it's a meta-analysis of a very large number of studies, many of which had nothing to do with COVID, and many of which did studies in masks that were not regularly worn every day and properly. So most epidemiologists, and this goes well beyond my own opinion, but most epidemiologists feel that that's a rather flawed study, that Cochrane report. In fact, it's been somewhat significantly criticized by a large number of epidemiologists, because when you look at it, there were only 2 studies in that entire meta-analysis that were exclusively looking at masks with COVID, not all of the other studies that are grouped in there that can somewhat dilute the data. So again, I did not do the study. I'm just reporting to you what other epidemiologists are having some concern about. That study could be a bit misleading.
And just going beyond that study, I mean, what should people know? What do we know about how effective it is to wear a mask?
When masks are properly worn and consistently worn, there's a number of good data to show that it is effective in preventing acquisition and transmission. But you've got to be looking at a study in which masks are worn essentially all of the time, not put the mask on, take it off, put it on, take it off. That leaves you vulnerable to transmission and acquisition. And so if you do it right, it's pretty clear that masks are very helpful in preventing acquisition and transmission.
Mhm. And we actually have a question related to masks. One audience member wrote in and she would like to know, is it safe now to attend meetings or go to church without wearing a mask? Or are we still in a stage where we should be wearing masks in crowded situations?
Well, it depends on where in the country and region and world you are. If you are in a region in which, if you look at the CDC's monitoring of the level of infection and the level of hospitalizations in a particular area, if you are at a low level, then you make a decision yourself. Everyone is different. Everyone's risk for a complication is different. So there's no set rule. Yes, you should or should not wear a mask in this particular setting, be it in a church or in a theater or where. It depends on a number of things. A, it depends upon the location you're in and the level of infection. B, it depends on the level of risk that you're willing to take. For example, if you are an elderly person and have one or more underlying conditions that would make you more susceptible to a severe outcome if you get infected, you may lean much more towards wearing a mask in a congregate setting, where in that same setting, someone else may say, I'm healthy, I'm in my 20s and 30s, I have no underlying condition. I'll take the small risk that one takes when you don't have a mask on. So it really is a lot of relative risk association. There's no one rule that essentially stands for every person in every particular place. You have to make your own judgment call.
And I'm curious about you personally, how much of your normal life have you resumed and what sorts of COVID precautions, if any, do you personally continue to take?
Well, I'm in an age category where I am at a higher risk of a severe outcome if I get infected. I'm vaccinated, doubly boosted. I've been infected and I've been boosted with an updated booster following infection. So I have a lot of immune response in me that I think is pretty good. That doesn't mean I'm reckless in going to a high prevalence area and go to a very crowded face-to-face situation without a mask. I won't, but I'm not wed to a mask in every indoor setting I go to. I don't go to restaurants a lot, very rarely, and for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with COVID. But when I'm in a situation like a crowded indoor setting, I may or may not wear a mask. I don't always wear a mask, namely because the level of infection in the community that I live right now is low. And I generally don't go in places that are terribly crowded. So you may see me outdoors, as people do, not wearing a mask. And then in some situations, you may see me, if we have a very crowded situation, that I would be wearing a mask. So I'm careful, but not to an extent that it inhibits greatly what I'm doing.
Great, thank you. Let me take one more question from the audience. This is also prevention related. Christine asks, how often should a 61-year-old with no particular risk factors receive a COVID booster?
Yeah, well, as you probably know, and I think the questioner probably realizes because it's been pretty much made public, that the FDA and the CDC also is leaning very heavily towards getting a yearly updated booster for COVID to be administered at approximately the same time and maybe simultaneously with the seasonal flu vaccine. Now, that's not a perfect solution, but it's one of those situations where you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, where if you can get a lot more people keeping updated regularly on a once-a-year basis, you could probably save a lot of infections and hospitalizations. So That's, although not an absolute recommendation, it's where the FDA and the CDC are leaning towards that once a year updated booster at a time when you're giving the flu shot on a seasonal basis.
Let me ask you now about something slightly different, just about long COVID. Can you just talk a little bit about what we know about this complex condition, what causes it, and how big of a threat it remains now at this stage of the pandemic?
Well, long COVID is a real phenomenon. It's the persistence or evolution of new symptomatology after the acute phase and recovery from a typical COVID infection, be it one that's mildly, moderately, or severely symptomatic. You can get long COVID after any of those scenarios. And it's a constellation of signs and symptoms, the underlying pathogenesis of which is not known, though there are some hints about some aberrant immunological or inflammatory response associated with COVID. And the symptoms are protean. They're very, very wide ranging, from severe fatigue, exercise intolerance, sleep disorders, neurological situations like tingling in the fingers and the toes, and temperature dysregulation. The bottom line is we need to know a lot more and learn a lot more about long COVID, because it's symptoms that can last anywhere from weeks to months to as long as a year in some individuals. And the percentage of people who get it range from a few percent to up to 15%. There are large cohort studies going on to study it, to determine the prevalence, the incidence, the underlying pathogenesis, and any biomarkers that we can follow that might give us some insight into what the underlying pathogenesis is. Once you determine what the underlying pathogenesis is, then you perhaps can design some therapeutic intervention.
Mm-hmm. And does it seem like it's kind of a constellation of different conditions with different causes, some due to kind of having a reservoir of the virus still circulating in your body, some triggered by your immune system? Is that
We
right?
don't know. That's a good question, Anna, but we don't know. It could be all of the above. You mentioned two of the prevailing theories that are really theories and not necessarily proven facts, that there is some degree of viral fragments, not necessarily replication competent virus, but viral fragments that continue to trigger an ongoing underlying immune response that's very difficult to get your arms around, namely to measure or to quantitate. And others are some triggering of immunological phenomenon that isn't readily apparent. It doesn't express itself in the typical markers of inflammation like sedimentation rate or C-reactive protein, but yet there is a degree of aberrant immune activation that causes the symptomatology, which were known as long COVID.
And how big of a threat is long COVID now at this stage of the pandemic?
Well, it appears that long COVID is less of an incidence now than it was, for example, during Delta. As we got into the Omicron era, it appears to occur, but less frequently. And again, that is not the result of a very definitive study, but there's a strong suggestion. Also, we know that if you get vaccinated and then get infected versus infected without having been vaccinated before, that the chances of getting long COVID are diminished by a prior vaccination. So we're learning, again, a fair amount about it, although it still remains somewhat of an elusive syndrome.
I'm going to take another question from the audience. This reader would like to know whether you think the government is prematurely giving up on trying to mitigate COVID-19. The public health emergency President Biden said would be lifted in May, and there are fewer and fewer kind of warnings and sort of public education campaigns about how to protect yourself. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it would be a misrepresentation to say that the government is giving up on the concern about COVID. Not at all. I mean, if you look at the CDC's information that comes out, if you look at the information that comes out from the COVID response team that's currently led by Dr. Ashish Jha, formerly led by Dr. Jeff Zients. I was part of that team until I stepped down from the NIH. No one is giving up on the importance of taking seriously COVID until we get it down to a low enough level where it doesn't disrupt us at all and we could approach some degree of normality. And as I mentioned a little while ago, 400 to 500 deaths is not where we want to be. We want to do much, much better than that.
Mhm. And I know you spoke about this a little bit in the Boston Globe magazine interview with you as well, but do you feel like this is the right time to be lifting the public health emergency?
Well, I think we want to get back to some degree of normality. Lifting the public health emergency doesn't necessarily mean that all activity is going off. I mean, there has some implications of that. For example, people who are not insured may not have the ability to have access to some of the interventions, but the government is making an effort, even in the absence of a public health emergency, if it's taken down, for example, in early May, that there will still be some mechanism whereby vaccinations and therapies and testing can be made available to the uninsured.
Okay, going back to the fall, early in the fall, we saw some unusual patterns in virus spread. For example, influenza hit much earlier in the season than normal. RSV also hit earlier and in some cases appeared to be more severe in children. I'm curious to know what you think caused that, and if that is kind of a new pattern, will that repeat itself next fall, or do you think it was kind of a one-off as we emerge from the pandemic?
Well, we have to be humble about it, Anna, and say we don't know. I mean, you can guess what you think is going to happen, but you don't know from one year to another. One of the things that we do know that viruses have niches, and when you have a pandemic that overwhelms the system, and the system is society, where it's a pandemic the likes of which we haven't seen in over 100 years, you are going to bump off the radar screen and disturb the normal cadence of infections at a time when they occur. And that's the reason why the year before, not this winter, but the year before and the year before that, in 2020, the level of influenza practically disappeared in 2021 because there was so much pandemic COVID that we saw very, very little RSV and very, very little influenza. So now when you get to this past fall and winter, we saw influenza and RSV come back with somewhat of a vengeance. It came back early and hard, both RSV and influenza. That's not surprising since you perturbed the natural rhythm of the evolution of these infections profoundly by the pandemic of COVID itself. Now you're asking me, does that mean next year and then the year after we're going to turn to the normal cycle where influenza and RSV are predominantly in the middle of the winter? I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if that does normalize in the next year, but I can't say for sure.
So even as we're still kind of emerging from this current pandemic, there are frequent reports about possible next pandemics. And right now, the avian influenza H5N1 has been in the news a lot. And I'm wondering how serious of a threat is that right now, this highly infectious form of it, and could that be our next pandemic?
Well, the answer is certainly it can. I can't quantitate how serious it is. Again, that's a non-quantitatable question you're asking me. It is a threat. It's real. What are the chances that we're having a pandemic? I have no idea. I don't think you can predict that accurately. There is some concern because, we had H5N1 and then H7N9 back in 2005 and then again in 2013, and we actually made and stockpiled vaccines against H5N1 back then. And I was very much heavily involved in that process back in 2005 and 2013. We're now seeing bird flu. That's a highly pathogenic bird flu among birds, chickens, and other wildlife. The thing that's disturbing is that it has now jumped over into mammals, into minks, into seals, into other mammals. And that is disturbing because once it adapts itself to mammals, that means it's getting closer to adapting itself to humans. A jumping from a bird to a human is less likely than jumping from a bird to a mammal to a human. So it makes it more likely that the threat of an H5N1, it's greater once the virus gets into mammals. And we know it's done that. And in fact, there have been 2 cases in Cambodia of a jumping into a children, one of which actually died from the virus. And if you look back at the history of H5N1, when there were, dozens, if not a couple of hundred cases back years ago, the mortality of that disease was anywhere from 30 to 40% or more. So that's one of the concerns that you have. Yes, the short answer to your question is we need to pay attention to it because it could be a threat for the next pandemic.
Mhm. As you think about kind of the landscape of infectious disease threats, kind of pandemic level threats, what are you most concerned about?
Well, I'm still concerned about coronaviruses because there are a lot of coronaviruses out there. We've had 3 outbreaks of coronaviruses. One was SARS-CoV-1 in 2002, one was MERS in 2012, and now we have COVID-19 in the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020. So I think that's pretty much of a lessons learned. We have to really be careful and pay attention to these evolving coronaviruses in the environment, which is the reason why you heard me discuss about the importance of surveying the environment and seeing what's out there, not manipulating it, but surveying it and seeing what's out there in order to get a feel for what the threat is. The other possibility is what you just mentioned, another pandemic flu. We've had a devastating pandemic of flu in 1918, killed anywhere from 50 to 100 million people globally. Then we had another pandemic in 1957, another one in 68, and another one in 2009. So the idea of a pandemic influenza is not just, some made up threat. It's something we've experienced multiple times before. So I would think that pandemic flu and coronaviruses are just 2 of the possibilities of an outbreak of the next pandemic.
What do you think, we have learned so many lessons from the current pandemic, but where do you think gaps remain in terms of our preparedness for the next pandemic?
Well, if you look at the lessons learned from the COVID-19, I, for clarity's sake, put the response, the preparedness and the response into 2 separate buckets. One is the scientific response, and the other is the public health response. If you look at the response scientifically and the preparedness scientifically, it was a resounding success because investments were made over decades in the fundamental basic and clinical science, which led to the platform technology, in this case, the mRNA and other platform technologies, and the structure-based immunogen design to get the most immunogenic of the different proteins, in this case, the spike protein of COVID, to induce a very powerful immune response to lead to the development and testing of a safe and effective vaccine within 11 months of the identification of the sequence of the new novel coronavirus that turned out to be SARS-CoV-2. So from a science standpoint, which is vaccine development and also the development of drugs like Paxlovid and other drugs, a resounding success. However, when you look at the public health bucket, we didn't do as well. And that's because I believe we let the infrastructure of our local public health system really not advance into the 21st century. It wasn't advanced to the point of having things electronically interchangeable. I mean, information, instead of being available in real time, sometimes took weeks or months to be able to calculate. The ability to trace the strain and the evolution of the virus, we could have done much better now. The CDC now has tried, and hopefully they'll be successful in really upgrading what they're capable of doing in an outbreak. And I think to their credit, they admit and realize that they could have done much better. So if we can shore that up and shore up the infrastructure at the local public health level, as well as maintaining the support scientifically of basic and clinical research, I think we can do better in the next outbreak, whenever that occurs. That could be a year from now, 5 years from now, or 20 years from now. We don't know.
And what more do you think can be done about the politicization of science and the misinformation that comes out, about vaccinations, about masks, since, that's kind of been, one of the biggest challenges to the public health response is kind of this mistrust in science and government policy?
Well, it's very unfortunate because what you say is true. I mean, there has been a considerable amount of politicization of science, and we can see that because of the divisiveness in our own country, where clear fundamental public health principles are not adhered to. In fact, there's polar opposites of the people deciding whether it's important to get vaccinated or to get boosted or to wear a mask or what have you. That's unfortunate, and I don't think I have a clear, easy answer to this. This is something that's somewhat deep-seated, and the only way that we can counter misinformation is by putting out a considerable amount with a degree of effort of what the correct public health-based, evidence-based information is. And that's the reason why I believe scientists should be out there more talking about true data and true evidence-based information, as opposed to the distortion and misinformation that seems to be so prevalent these days.
One of our questions actually goes just to that. An audience member, talked about how personable you are and how good you are in one-on-one conversation, and whether you have any interest, post-government service in talking to groups of skeptics, people who, don't believe in vaccinations, or, are concerned about vaccinations, or don't believe in mask wearing. Is that anything that you have an interest in doing?
Well, I'm doing it right now as we're speaking. So therefore, I am interested in doing it. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be writing and lecturing and getting involved in different groups that are in the arena of public health, global health, and public service. Obviously, it will come up that you want to talk about the importance of making decisions based on real data and real evidence. And that's something that I have already been speaking about since I stepped down from the NIH at the end of December, the beginning of January. And I believe that's what I will continue to be doing over the next few years, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move, more into the life after government portion of our conversation. So one reader asks, what do you feel is your most personally rewarding accomplishment during your remarkable career at the NIH?
Well, I have been in the very fortunate and privileged position to have worn 3 hats in my career, which spans 54 years at the NIH and 38 years as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And in that more than half a century of government service, I have 3 hats. One is as a scientist. One is as the director of a large institute, the largest research institute in infectious diseases in the world. And the other is that someone who had the opportunity to get involved in policy making. So as a scientist, I feel very good about my contributions, both pre-HIV, namely when I did the work on developing therapeutic regimens that are highly successful in putting into a high level of remission non-neoplastic inflammatory, non-infectious inflammatory diseases of the blood vessels called the vasculitides. and then spending 40 years of work delineating the pathogenic mechanisms of HIV. So that's my own individual research accomplishment. The second hat is as the director of the NIAID, where I feel most proud of developing the AIDS program, which in collaboration over decades with the pharmaceutical companies was responsible for the development of the therapeutic regimens, the combination cocktails of drugs that have essentially transformed the lives of persons with HIV, turning it from essentially an inevitable death sentence into a situation where people can lead essentially normal lifespan. That entire process, which I was deeply involved in, has saved millions of lives throughout the world, without a doubt. And then with regard to policy, the thing that I believe, to me, I feel most proud of is the role I played together with President George W. Bush, who allowed me to be one of the architects of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which in the developing world, in what it has done to treat, prevent, and care for persons with HIV in Southern Africa and the developing world, that program, which I played a role in being one of the architects, has already resulted in saving 25 million lives worldwide. So that's something you have to feel good about.
I'm curious if you could tell us more about, on a personal level, how has life for you changed since you left government service?
Well, it's changed because I'm no longer the director of a $6.5 billion institute with thousands of employees and an immediate staff of about 20. And now I'm sitting in my office at home and I'm a one-man band. No, but I will very likely be associated with an organization sometime soon. I'm saying that facetiously, but I'm continuing to lecture, to write, to get involved in situations like we're doing right now with you with the Boston Globe. But I will be continuing along the line of activities in the arena of public health and infectious diseases. And very likely over the next several months, will associate myself with an organization so that I will have a staff to help me do that.
Mm-hmm. Psychologically, is it a strange kind of shift in identity where you've been NIAID director for so long and now, at least temporarily, you're sort of a free agent?
No, I don't think it's a change of identity. I know who I am. I'm confident in who I am, whether I'm with the NIH or I'm not. I am who I am. The NIH is a spectacular, phenomenal organization. I had to step down sometime, and I wanted to step down when I still had a few more years, when I'm energetic, I'm passionate, I'm enthusiastic about doing new things. And thank goodness I'm healthy and able to do that. And that's the reason why I stepped down at that time. There's a time to step down. Everything must come to an end. As George Harrison said in his album when the Beatles broke up, all things must pass. All things must pass. I have a great deal of affection for the NIH. It will always be near and dear to my heart. But now I'm ready to do new things with new challenges.
Mm-hmm. What else can we expect from your next chapter? Tell us a little bit more about what your plans are, what you hope to accomplish in the coming years.
Well, as I've said multiple times, the broad 40,000 foot picture is that I ask myself what I can offer society now. I know what I offered society during my tenure at NIH for the more than half a century that I was there. What I can offer now, given my experience with advising 7 presidents of the United States and leading a major institution for almost 40 years, I have experience, I have judgment, and I believe that I hopefully can inspire younger people to get interested in science, perhaps in public health, and perhaps even in public service. And there are multiple ways to do that. I will be writing a memoir, my memoir, because I think younger individuals might benefit from that. They could possibly be inspired by that. So I will begin doing that imminently. And then I don't know, it probably would take the better part of a year to get that done. That's one of my goals. I will continue to be lecturing, continue to be writing, and continue to teaching, all in the spirit of trying to get younger generation interested and passionate about science, medicine, and public health. That's my general plan over the next few years.
I also read in one interview that you said that you might be interested in going back and treating patients again.
Yeah. Well, I never left treating patients. So it is the question of going back to, it's continuing to see patients. And that would be really dependent on what organization, what university, what hospital I associate myself with. And I haven't made that decision yet.
Okay. Great. One reader also wanted to know if, I know that you've had dealt with a lot of death threats and just threats, throughout the course of your, tenure during the pandemic. Have those dissipated at all since you left government?
Unfortunately not. Every time someone gets up and makes a conspiratorial accusation that, I've destroyed the country's economy, or I created the virus in my kitchen, or something like that, then the threats elevate, and then they level off, come down, then they elevate again. So they really haven't diminished since I stepped down.
In what form do you receive them? Are they emails or on
Everything, emails, phone calls, texts. To me, my wife, and my children too, which is, I think, the most disturbing aspect of it, the cowardice of people to essentially harass and attack my wife and my children, which, just shows you the fundamental character of those people. Pure cowardice, total.
And you still have guards, is that right? That have to be posted outside of your house?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
No, thank you. This is a very good conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to having to chat with the people who've asked the good questions. They were really quite good questions. So it was quite enjoyable. I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Fauci.
My pleasure. Take care.